How many professional structural architects and engineers?
2,333.
I'm outside the Magistrates' Court in Hastings and I'm with Matt Campbell. You've got a court case involving the BBC. Do you think you could explain to us what the court case is about?
Yeah, I've been summoned here to stand trial for the non-payment of the TV licence, which I'm withholding the payment of because I have reasonable cause to suspect that I'd be funding the purposes of terrorism if I pay the TV licence and effectively fund the BBC, because they are covering up the true events of that day, and they're also, distorting and manipulating video footage in some of their documentaries of explosions. And of course there's the prescient report of the collapse of Building 7, which is, for them not to inform the authorities and to follow up on that is an offence under Section 38B of the Terrorism Act. And I mean, ultimately this is a conflict of law case. I'm more than willing to pay for an appropriate licence, provided no funds go to the BBC.
So have you contacted the BBC with your complaints and what's their response?
I have written to them ever since my licence ran out, and eventually after 4 months a chap turned up at my house, and that was really the start of this process. So they hadn't really responded prior to that. A few letters were exchanged, but it was very much, it doesn't matter what I argue. They said it's an offence not to have a TV licence, and I would argue that the TV licence is actually an inappropriate TV licence. A more appropriate one that I would be happy to pay for would be one where the funds don't go to the BBC.
So do you think you might win your court case today?
I would hope so. I mean, the biggest problem we've got is the prosecution is arguing that it's what's called a strict liability offence, which basically means I'm not allowed to defend myself. So even though that's a violation of my human rights under Article 6, it would essentially mean I can't actually defend myself, which is a ludicrous situation to be in. Conflicts of law, quite clearly a conflict of law, but whether the magistrates court is able to handle that, I don't know.
So if you don't win the case today, are you going to go further?
Let's see how today goes.
Okay, thanks Matt. We'll catch you after the court case. Thank you.
I'm representing architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth for the UK. The evidence that I'm here to present with Matt is really to support what he's saying about the evidence of how World Trade Center Building 7 came down, whether it came down through what the official story have said through office fires or whether there were explosives involved. The BBC have run a lot of documentaries on that issue, but what they've absolutely flatly refused to show, to tell the public about, is the most important piece of evidence that there is regarding this issue. In November 2008, NIST, the official investigators into the collapse of the towers, came out and were really forced to officially recognise the fact that Building 7 came down at freefall acceleration. Now, any physicist, any architect, any engineer who knows anything about that knows that the only way that a building can come down in freefall in any way is through controlled demolition, because the entire structure of the building has to be taken out simultaneously. So that can only happen through planned explosives, controlled demolition. So when NIST made that announcement, that should have been the biggest story. That should have been instant global news around the world, that was basic confirmation of controlled demolition of that building. How did that happen? That should have been the biggest news story in the world. All that information has been put forward to the BBC. They've completely ignored it and refused to show it. We've had more than 500 members of the public that have sent letters to the BBC, experts from around the world also sending letters to the BBC with their evidence, asking them to show the public that evidence, which is basically proof of controlled demolition of that building. They've absolutely refused to do it. It's nothing more than a cover-up on the way the events of 9/11.
Right, okay, so have you tried to contact the BBC Trust with your...
As I said, we've had more than 500 letters from the public, as well as many world experts on this have contacted the BBC Trust, as well as the MPs, to put forward this information, this evidence, and demand that the BBC, they've got to do their job. They've got a job to the public through their Royal Charter, their editorial guidelines, to put forward this information. This is incredibly important political information that they're just flatly refusing to show to the public. And the consequences of informing the public about this information are huge. So it is a cover-up.
So I'm also here with Adrian Mallet. Adrian, could you explain where you're from and why you're coming here today to support Matt Campbell?
Well, I'm here to help him giving evidence as well. I have an civil engineering degree, and I also served in Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue for 9 years. And the official version of how Building 7 came down is that there was a fire. And the fire took out one of the columns, and then the building collapsed. It's just ridiculous. So I'm here to present that side of it, that you couldn't do it. Even if you filled the entire building with wood, soaked it in petrol, set fire to the lot, you'd get sagging columns, you'd get sagging beams. You certainly wouldn't get a complete collapse down to 3 stories of rubble in a few seconds. Just wouldn't happen. So it's, again, to help with that. And I was also part of the BBC, the campaign to put a complaint into the BBC about a couple of programmes. One in particular was a 9/11 conspiracy roadshow, or road trip, which Goebbels would have been proud of. So it's really for that.
And what makes you say that about that particular programme?
That particular programme, the BBC tried to do such items as proving that thermite couldn't melt steel by pouring a small pile of thermite on a very thick steel beam and then setting light to it. In order for the thermite to actually melt the steel, the energy has to be contained and directed. Thermite demolition charges were patented in 1984. Thermite's been used to melt steel rails since 1820. So as a result, trying to prove that thermite can't melt steel, why would you do that? And the only reason they did it was to discredit the small group of young, inexperienced 9/11 truthers that they targeted the programme at. The same group of truthers, we know from one of them, kept going on and on and on about Building 7 during the trip. It was never even mentioned. Another part of the programme, they tried to take a light aircraft and by taking one of them up in a light aircraft and getting them to take the controls, they tried to prove that the terrorists could have hijacked the airliners and smashed them into the buildings. And it's just, the whole thing was just ridiculous.
I just think what Matt's doing is he's trying to bring attention to this fact and the fact that he lost his brother in 9/11. You know, he's extremely passionate about what he's doing and the reasons that he's doing it, and that helps to bring attention to the fact that most people have not seen the evidence and don't know these issues that we're talking about, because the BBC and the media have simply refused to cover them. And these are issues that, you know, have having such a big impact on world politics and what's going on with the wars in the Middle East. And so, you know, Matt's taken a courageous stand with what he's doing.
The government's trying to push through this law whereby we do away with the TV licence, and the TV cost is paid for out of your council tax, with the council tax increase.
Is there anything that people can do to try and campaign against that? Because that takes people's choice away, because some people choose not to have a TV anyway, and so that means that they would be paying. So surely that should be illegal.
It should be illegal to kill 450 British troops on the back of a massive lie, but they still get away with it. The main thing people need to do is go and badger their MPs, because they're the ones that, until enough people start banging on their doors, they won't do anything.
Sheila Coombs, and you're from Frome.
Yes.
And why have you come to Hastings today?
I've come to support Matt Campbell in his fight for justice for his brother, who was killed in the North Tower of the World Trade Center attacks on 9/11. I feel that the investigation, which even two of the authors of the report that came out said it was set up to fail, it's not a valid investigation into the murder of 3,000 innocent people. So I've come to support Matt. He wants a proper investigation into his brother's death, well, his murder actually. So yes, we feel that it's time that the governments in America and Europe really looked into this tragedy, which has actually been the catalyst for the war on terror. So not only did this dreadful, fateful event of 9/11 kill 3,000 people on that day, the upshot of it was hundreds of thousands of people have been killed on something that hasn't been proven to have been happened in the way that the official story says. You cannot refute these architectural, physical findings, and I think it's the way forward. And please come along to any event that you can get to, because, as I say, this is history being made.
Why are you here today?
I'm Ken O'Keefe. I'm actually producing a documentary about the BBC. One of our guests in the program is Tony Rook and his case, so this case is obviously very similar. And I wanted to see what happened today with regard to the argument that you're compelling me to break the law. I like the argument. I think it's sound. It's about the BBC. My position is very strong. The BBC is absolute propaganda. They basically are an extension of the government, and the government's policy is war after war after war, just like my birth nation, the United States. It's never-ending war. They're even trying to pick a fight with Russia right now. I mean, this is pure insanity. The BBC is right there, lockstep in line with these policies, and I consider that to be a criminal offense. And I don't understand how anyone can pay to be lied to in the most obscene of ways, especially when sons and daughters, American sons and daughters, British sons and daughters, are going to be sent off to fight these illegal, unlawful, immoral, unjust wars in which immeasurable suffering is thrust upon innocent people. I mean, I don't think the invasion of Iraq could have happened without the BBC. They're the most influential media institution on the planet, given their gargantuan size and budget. They have more influence, or at least they did. Thankfully, a lot more people are understanding just how horrendously propagandistic they are, but they sell war. And if we go back to the Nuremberg principles, which I have a lot of criticisms of the Nuremberg tribunals, but the bottom line is, one of the things they concluded I absolutely agree with, and that is that war is the supreme crime. Everything that comes after war stems from the original crime of war of aggression, and the BBC is instrumental in that.
And have you tried to contact the BBC with your concerns, and if so, what has been their response?
I have indeed, yes. I've attempted to get an interview with the highest levels of the BBC when that became obvious they weren't going to do it. I said, well, okay, you've got, I forget what their budget is, but it's so many tens of millions a year in the public relations department. And I said, listen, if you don't have any of the trustees or the managing director or anything like that, then let us have someone from the public relations department. We have legitimate questions regarding people's concerns about the charter and violations of the charter. And at the end of the day, they said no. And I said, well, listen, okay, let's be clear here. And at this point, I had many license fee payers, about over a dozen. Combined, they have paid the BBC license fee for over 400 years. A couple of them are like 50 years plus they've been paying. And I got them to look at what we were going to ask, and they supported our endeavor to interview the BBC, and they didn't care one bit about that. At the end of the day, I said, okay, to be clear, you're saying we cannot interview anybody there, and I'm telling you now, you can give us any time, any place, 6 months, a year down the road, whatever you like, whatever, we'll be there. So, And they said no. And that's the BBC for you. What do they care? They're a law unto themselves. They've got a massive budget. They've got the court system set up to threaten and intimidate people to fund their propaganda machine so they can be lied to. And they've got the favor of the government, the courts, the police, and everything. So why would they care what I think or anybody else thinks? They're as arrogant gets. And in a way, I almost admire them for their arrogance. I mean, it's so in your face. If the rest of us tolerate it, well, okay. I don't know why we would tolerate it for a second, but apparently we do, or at least a lot of us do.
So when will your film be available for people to watch?
It's going to air in the all things going as planned. It'll air like the first week of May. It's a 2-part program. It's called In Focus on Press TV, and it's 25-minute programs, 2 of them. So one will show one week and then another one the next week.
I understand you're going to have Richard Gage appear in it as well.
Yeah, I'm going to be interviewing Richard, and we've got some other great people that have already been interviewed as well. Just interviewed Greg Philo, professor who did the book Bad News from Israel and More Bad News from Israel. An incredible scholarly study into the mainstream media, specifically ITV and BBC. We interviewed David Icke, who was a former employee of the BBC, Alan Hart, former employee of the BBC, and Dr. Curtis Dobler, a very prominent international human rights attorney. So we've got some really good people on there. I'm born and raised in America, joined the Marine Corps at 19 years old, believing my nation's the greatest in the world and all that sort of nonsense. And I had experiences in the military that where I spoke out, and I was punished severely. And that was a shock to me. It was a trauma. I thought that you got rewarded for honorable, honorable living. And when I found out that actually the people get punished for doing the right thing, it totally transformed my way of thinking. If I'm wrong about the Marine Corps, what else am I wrong about? Because it helped open up my mind to other possibilities. I commenced to a course of independent study for many years, and the more I learned, the more I realized the birth nation that I have believed to be the greatest in the world is responsible for more death and suffering than really any other nation in the world in the 20th and 21st century. But in terms of spreading it all around the world, distributing it around the world, propping up corrupt dictatorships and whatnot, I realized that, wow, my country's not a friend to popular democracy, it's the greatest enemy of it. And this angered me. So I've been involved in direct actions. I've been an activist for many years. I did the Human Shield Action to Iraq, trying to stop the invasion. I've been involved in Palestinian issues for many years. I'm just a firm believer that if you want to change the world, it really is up to us.
Chris Coverdale.
And you've come today to support Matt Campbell.
I have indeed, yes, particularly on the legal side.
And you've just come out of the court.
I've just come out of the court. It was really a no-show. What happened was that there was an argument about strict liability and whether or not this was a strict liability offence. 10 minutes from the prosecution, 10 minutes from the defence, and the important arguments weren't raised. And so the magistrates have agreed it's a strict liability offence. Important legal issues which underpin the whole case, which are to do with the Terrorism Act and whether or not Section 15 of the Terrorism Act applies to the licence fee as well as to tax payments and others. None of that was raised in court. And yet that was the whole purpose for being here today, was to raise that as his defence, and it wasn't raised. The Terrorism Act 2000, Section 15, makes it an offence to demand tax or money, to collect money or to pay money if it is used for the purposes of terrorism. Now, that's a very powerful statement. If we can prove that the British government and the BBC are pursuing the purposes of terrorism, then it is a criminal offence to hand over the licence fee or to pay tax to the council or to the Revenue and Customs. That in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a ruling in the case Regina versus Gould, said that the military and quasi-military activities of the British government are terrorism. So as soon as they said that, it means that Section 15 of the Terrorism Act comes into play, and any money we pay to the British government is going for the purposes of terrorism, as agreed by the Supreme Court. Now that's a very powerful argument, and it gives us the duty to refuse to hand over tax, refuse to hand over licence fees, to refuse to hand over council tax. Any taxes whatsoever, VAT and all the rest.
Mahtab Aziz, I'm a solicitor. I came here today to represent Matt Campbell for his matter of non-payment of TV licence.
What was the legal argument in his defence?
The argument was that, that Matt had a defence to the allegation, and part of the process was that there were legal arguments submitted. On our part, we were arguing that it's not a strict liability offence, and therefore he should be afforded a chance to put forward his defence. The prosecution were arguing that it is a strict liability offence, and they based that on some higher court decisions, which were tending to side on this being a strict liability offence. I argued in terms of the fact that there's a great disparity as to how this offence is dealt with at the courts. There's evidence to suggest that about 2,000 people on average per month are found not guilty. That's a very, very high figure for what is a so-called strict liability offence. And that means that perhaps the courts don't have a uniform approach to this allegation.
So are the other cases to do with non-payment of the TV licence?
Or yes. It is.
Yeah.
This is only, those figures only relate to non-payment of the TV licence. And the information was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act, show that about 2,000 people per month are found not guilty by magistrates for this offence. And that can be up to about 15% of the total of people that have been summoned to court. That's an extraordinarily high figure. If you compare that to, say, not having car insurance and being stopped by the police, find 2,000 people per month being found not guilty of not having insurance, because that is an example of a strict liability offence. And I think the reason why this happens is that when Capita send people around to people's homes and they question the occupants, I believe that in a lot of cases the occupants are given or afforded an opportunity to pay for the licence. Now, if you compare that to the scenario of police officer stopping someone because he suspects them of not having car insurance, you'd hardly ever get an officer saying, "Okay, go along and make sure you get your insurance the next day or so." That doesn't happen, and therefore, my argument was that by giving an occupant the chance to obtain the licence, it doesn't conform with what a strict liability offence is supposed to be about.
So what happened in the court today? Was it a success or a failure?
Sorry,
what happened in the court today? Was it a success or a failure?
Right, well, what happened was that the two sides, the defence and prosecution, put forward their arguments about the issue of strict liability, and as anticipated, the magistrates took the view of the prosecution and said that this was a strict liability offence. Now, once they've decided that issue, it was pretty. It would have been pretty difficult to try and proceed on a not guilty basis. So Matt reconsidered his plea and entered a plea of guilty, but put forward mitigation as to why he hadn't paid his licence. And ultimately he was given a fine of £75, and he was given asked to pay prosecution costs as well, which is normal, and that was it.
So is there going to be an appeal, or not sure yet?
I mean, we are considering the options. There are 3 options, and I will consider those with Matt in the next few days. We have 21 days to consider that.
Mainstream media here? I don't think mainstream. Well, this is probably kind of heavy.
Hi Matt, so you've just come out of the court. What was the result? What happened today?
Well, as we suspected, they ruled it as a strict liability offence. Didn't seem to deliberate very long, and they admitted before that they hadn't actually read the skeleton arguments put forward. We had 10 minutes. Probably took longer to read that, to digest it. But they came out and ruled it as a strict liability. We decided that it would be best to change the plea to a guilty one. There's nothing I can do once they've ruled it strict liability. And they charged £300 prosecution costs, £75 fine, and whatever it was, £20 victim something or other, which is, it's obviously very disappointing. I wasn't allowed to even make a statement in mitigation. My lawyer started to mention one of the pieces of evidence, and that was just cut dead immediately. So yeah, I'm disappointed that I wasn't able to certainly present evidence, but not even make a statement. It's disappointing because Tony Rook, I think, pretty set a precedent in this similar type of action, similar arguments. He got a district judge to sit over the case. He got a conditional discharge and no fine. They refused. I put in a request for it to be presided over by a district judge. They turned that down and kept it as a lay bench. And they've obviously chosen to charge more costs and a fine.
So what do you think you're going to do now? Is there anything else you could do?
I've got three options, which I'm going to take legal advice and I'm going to consider them. I can review. There'd be a review of the sentence. I can ask for a judicial review, or I could actually appeal to a higher court. Don't know yet which one of those actions I'll be taking. I think for the appeal I've got 21 days to make a decision. Well, they fined me £75 after they ruled it was a strict liability offence and I wasn't allowed to defend myself. It's a clear violation of my human rights under Article 6 of the right to a fair trial, to be able to bring witnesses and produce evidence. And they also charged £300 prosecution costs.
So are you going to be appealing?
I've got three options. I've got a review I could do of the sentence, a judicial review, or an appeal to a higher court. The latter I've got sort of 21 days to make a decision. I'm going to take legal advice. It's to do with the conflict of law, and effectively I have reasonable cause to suspect that if I paid the TV licence which funds the BBC, which is willfully covering up the events of 9/11, refusing to inform the public of the monumental scientific importance of the freefall collapse of Building 7. And in their conspiracy files documentaries, they do devious things like edit out the sounds of explosions and the sounds of some men saying the building's about to blow up. You've got to ask yourself, why are they doing this and for what purpose? And I would argue that it's to further the purposes of terrorism, and I don't want to be any part of that, and I certainly don't want to commit a crime, which I would be under Section 15, Article 3 of the Terrorism Act. It's up to each individual to whether they have to have the suspicion or not, and I said it's just reasonable cause to suspect. So if once you've looked at the evidence, you believe that the BBC are deliberately covering up this information, then if you do suspect that, then you would actually be guilty of, potentially guilty of committing a crime under the terrorism legislation by funding the TV licence at the BBC.